What's going on, everybody? It's ETAPRIME back here again. Today we're going to be turning this inexpensive office PC into a 1440p sleeper. Now this is something I've been wanting to do for a while with these little office PCs, and there's several different versions that you can use, but recently we've actually started getting really decent prices on these Optiplex 760s, and obviously I wanted to use the small form factor version. They make a micro, which we really can't do much with unless you add an external GPU, and they also have their mini tower, which in my opinion, if you're not worried about the form factor, would probably be the best option. But right now, you can actually scoop these up anywhere from $100 up to $179, depending on how the config is set up from whoever's selling it over on eBay. And with this, we're going to be working with an Intel i7 8700. So we've got 6 cores, 12 threads, and there's still more ports we need to add here to make it a gaming PC. But before we get into it, I do want to mention that this video is sponsored by Urcdkeys. I've been using this site for a long time. They offer Steam keys, Uplay, Ubisoft, but the main thing I usually pick up over here are Windows 10 Pro OEM keys. And right now, if you use code ETA, you can get 25% off, bringing the price down to $17 for that key. And keep in mind, this will also work with Microsoft Office products. We'll use code ETA. As you can see, brought it down to that $17 price mark. Personally, I use PayPal just to have that security, so we'll go ahead and check out. They're going to email that code to you, and now we can use that code to activate Windows 10 Pro. I'm going to head over to my updates and security. We're going to go to activation. As you can see, I've got Windows 10 Pro, but it's not activated. So I'm going to change product key. I'm going to paste it in here, choose next, choose activate, and Windows is now activated. We're ready to go. They'll email your code once your payment is processed, and that's basically it. If you're interested in picking up cheap Windows 10 keys for your new PC builds, I'll leave a link in the description. Okay, so what we've got here is a small form factor Optiplex 760. Again, you can pick these up anywhere from $100 up to $170, depending on the RAM and storage configuration. This one here came with 16 gigs of RAM and a 256 gigabyte M.2 SSD. Got it for $130 shipped. I would have loved to get it for much cheaper. At the time of purchasing this, they didn't have any up there that were kind of bare bones, so no storage and RAM. You can always add that later on down the road. But what we've got here is that Intel i7 8700. And in the past, we always kind of had to resort to using the older 4th gen or even 6th gen Intel CPUs. And in 2024, they are definitely a bit dated. The time is also catching up with the 8700, but with 6 cores and 12 threads here, it's still holding its own. It's actually performing much better than I thought. Now, of course, in order to game at 1440p on this, we're going to need a pretty powerful GPU, and there's not much room in these small form factor Dells. They did this on purpose. As you can see, that X16 slot is lowest on the board there, kind of making it almost impossible to put a dual slot GPU in there. So usually we have to resort to something like the RX 6400, which isn't a bad little GPU, but yeah, it's not going to do 1440p gaming. You could also go with something like the A2000 with a modified cooler. I've got one here, 6 gigs of RAM. It does perform really well for what we've got, but they are getting a bit harder to find for that lower price point we used to be able to pick these up for, and then you're going to have to go with a low profile cooler, so you're going to have to wait on that and spend a little more money. So for this build here, I'm actually going to be going with the dual slot card. We're going to be using the Low Profile RTX 4060. And of course, I just mentioned that, it's not going to fit in there like this thing is, but these PCs are cheap enough to go ahead and modify the case itself, and that's exactly what we're going to need to do here. But another thing we're going to need here is a new power supply, because that Low Profile RTX 4060, even though it's coming in small form factor, still requires an 8-pin PCIe connector. These 760s do have a proprietary Dell connector on the 200-watt power supply that's pre-installed here. It's known as the Dell 6-pin power supply connector, and we can actually get an adapter to go from a regular ATX 24-pin over to that, but we're not going to be fitting an ATX power supply inside of here, so we're going to have to go with something a bit smaller. And as you can see, we can actually get this RTX 4060 in that slot with that power supply removed, so I needed to come up with something that was a low enough profile so we could still fit this card in here. So what I'm going to be using for this setup is a 400-watt flex power supply from Viva, and this just happens to be fully modular also. These are only $44 over on Amazon, and I've used 2 of them in the past with small form factor build. Haven't run into any issues with them yet. And this actually slots down pretty nicely right there where that old power supply went. Now, of course, it's not a perfect fit, and there's a few little things we need to do, but it doesn't require any cutting or anything like that. And you might notice there's 2 little nubs in the back of this case. Luckily, this kind of slots right down in there, So it's not going to move forward, it's not going to move up, but we do need to at least mount 1 or 2 screws in the rear of this unit. And of course, if you're picking this thing up every day, shaking it around above your head or something like that, you might want to put another screw in here. But when I've got a gaming PC, it's usually just sitting here or on the desk. And this thing, once it's mounted in with everything in place, the power supply isn't going anywhere. Now we've got enough room to install this GPU, and there is more of a gap here. It's just the way it's situated right now. Once everything's in place, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. And of course, we do have to remove that GPU bracket unless you want to do some cutting to the case. I mean, it's really up to you. You could go crazy with it and cut this thing up. Or you could use some type of riser like this. This was my original thought. Actually, I was going to install this with that GPU sitting vertically. But since I've got enough room, with this new power supply installed, I'm just going to go directly to that slot. And I mentioned it earlier, but what I've got here is this 24-pin to 6-pin Dell adapter. These are $9 over on Amazon. I'll leave links for all of the little parts that I used here. Now, I'm not sure how many people are going to want to do something like this, but I think we can get some really great performance out of this little machine. And once it's all said and done, it looks a little something like this. Personally, I don't think it's a bad looking setup. It's actually pretty clean with that modular power supply. All of those cables actually fit behind that hard drive bracket, which you don't have to put back in if you don't want to. But since it's here, I figured we could use it to hide all those cables. Now it's time for the moment of truth. We're going to boot this thing up. And there are other GPUs that you could opt to use with something like this. They've got an RTX 3050, but keep in mind it's a really cut down RTX 3050. I really wanted as much GPU as I could put inside of this unit, and right now, without spending like $2,000 on an Ada generation GPU, the RTX 4060 Low Profile is definitely where it's at. And I know the PC really isn't old enough to be running something like XP, but I still wanted to go ahead and use this wallpaper here. Now we've got a pretty nice little gap between those triple fans on that RTX 4060 and the power supply, but I'll definitely keep an eye on GPU temps here. And just to give you a closer look at everything, I'm going to plug this into my game capture. Alright, so here we are, Windows 11. As you can see, we've got that i7 8700, 6 cores, 12 threads, 16 gigs of DDR4 dual channel at 2400 megahertz. Unfortunately, you really can't do any faster in this little system here. The main claim to fame for this little system is that GeForce RTX 4060. I was actually surprised that Intel Tuning Utility does work with this chip in this little Optiplex, so you could up that TDP, but just taking a look here, right there around 75 to 80 watts. And if you want to go any higher, yeah, I mean, you could take it up. But with this setup here, CPU temps are pretty decent and that fan doesn't ramp up. If I was to take this up to, let's say, 100 watts in total or even 120 on that boost side, the fan in this Optiplex does ramp up. It makes a little bit of noise. But yeah, I mean, I think we'll be okay at 4.2 across the board here. So far, not too bad. And the first thing I wanted to show off here were some benchmarks. Now, the main thing that's really going to hold this back is the older 8th gen Intel CPU. But it's still holding its own better than I thought it would. Geekbench 6, nothing to get excited about here with that 8700. Single core, 1530, multi, 6153. Nothing spectacular, but it is coming well ahead of the 4th gen and the 6th gens that we usually see in these small form factor Optiplexes or mini HP office PCs. Next up, we've got some GPU benchmarks with 3D Mark, Firestrike, 20,819. And finally, Time Spy with an 8,875. Jumping right into some gaming, we've got Cyberpunk 2077, 1080p Ultra with no DLSS. I didn't think it was going to do this well with the 8700. We're getting an average of 73 FPS, which is actually really good for a little machine like this, but there's still a lot more that we can get out of this. And one of the big reasons I wanted to go with a 4000 series card over 3000 is NVIDIA's frame generation. So I'll show you. When we go to Ultra, it turns on resolution scale. We're going to turn that off and just enable frame generation. 1080, we'll go ahead and apply. And now you'll see, instead of getting an average of around 73, Ultra, no DLSS, we're getting averages in the triple digits. So 103 FPS. But like I mentioned, I really wanted to see if we could game on this at 1440p. And we will need DLSS for 1440p on the RTX 4060. So let's go ahead and enable it. Up to 1440p, back to graphics, still at Ultra, we're using frame gen, and I'm going to turn DLSS right there to balance. And now, with those settings at 1440p, we're getting averages in the mid-90s. So having this kind of performance out of one of these Optiplexes is pretty awesome. And, you know, if you went with a better Optiplex, let's say something with the 10th gen, we could definitely see a nice hike in the performance, because what's holding us back is that CPU. But for what we've got here and the price paid for the base unit, I'm not complaining, because I'm seeing some pretty good performance. Next up, Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart 1440p, high with frame gen on, no DLSS. We could probably just go up to very high with it using that frame gen, but I've been playing through this game again. I personally love it, and it looks really good like this. Even adding a little bit of DLSS, like let's say go to quality with it at 1440p, really isn't going to degrade that picture too much. So if you need a little more out of it, yeah, you can definitely get it. Forza Horizon 5, knew it was going to run just fine with no DLSS. We don't need any kind of scaling here. And it looks like my monitor is maxing out at 144. Probably go over that. But yeah, with this RTX 4060 at 1440 ultra settings with this game here, not an issue. Also wanted to throw a fighting game in here, so we went with Mortal Kombat 1, 1440p, Ultra, no DLSS, just fine. And I mean, I'm actually really impressed by what the CPU's doing. It's definitely an older CPU, but given that we've got those 6 cores and 12 threads, I think that's really kind of keeping us up, especially over those older models. Fallout 4, just wanted to see what we could do, and at Ultra 1440p with this setup, we were dipping under 60. We were seeing an average of around 53, so I had to back it off to high, but at 1440 high, we can run this really well. And the final one I wanted to test here was Horizon Forbidden West. 1080p, very high, DLSS balanced with frame gen on. This is just a harder game to run, and at 1440, I'm sure we could get over 60 with it, adding a little more DLSS, like at performance. I actually didn't even test it just at 1080 because I know what kind of stress this puts on a CPU. I've been doing a lot of testing with it. Not bad, though. The last thing I wanted to talk about here were CPU and GPU temps. Well, there's not too much we can do about the CPU. I did replace the thermal paste on this. I just cleaned up the stock stuff, which was definitely dried out, with some Noctua NTH2. And our average CPU temps, all of this is while gaming, 79 degrees Celsius. The maximum CPU temp that I saw here was 91. And when it comes to that GPU, I was worried about it because of that gap between the power supply and that RTX 4060. But the temps on that were good, and I've got the Gigabyte version of the Low Profile 4060, so it's got that triple fan cooler, and average GPU temps were 66, maximum that I saw was 69. Overall, this actually performed much better than I thought it would with that i7 8700. I mean, I knew we were going to see some decent performance with that RTX 4060 inside of this unit, but I wasn't expecting 1440p gaming to do so well. But you know, with that, we are using a little bit of frame gen and DLSS. That's basically how it's going to have to be with this RTX 4060 paired up with that older CPU. Would I suggest you run out and do something like this? I mean, in the end, it's always going to be up to you. If you're in the market for a gaming PC, you want a little sleeper, this is something you could definitely do. Or you could just save what you were going to spend on this and build something with a bit more power. Either way, I'll leave links to everything I use for this build in the description. And if there's anything else you want to see running on this, just let me know in the comments below. But that's it for this one. Like always, thanks for watching.